My grandfather came when he was 17, and he never went back. I can't imagine, not going home.
When the foreigners and settlers landed, and when the First Nations people saw these people, they welcomed them with open arms and helped them. And in return, what did we get?
For thousands of years, numerous Indigenous nations have called the area that is now known as Canada home. At the start of the 17th century, the first permanent European colony was created. The coming of European traders, missionaries, troops, and colonists brought an irreversible change to the native way of life.
I'm of the Sturgeon clan, and I'm an Anishinaabe from Niskandaga. I come from a place that used to be called Lansdowne House. And from what I understand, my grandfather was the one that changed it. And he called it Niskandaga, which means Cedar Point. Very beautiful area.
My father was born in Victoria, and my mother was born in Vancouver. Now, my paternal grandfather came to Victoria, or landed in Victoria actually, in 1881.
And then my grandfather was born in Kirkcaldy over in Scotland, but came over as an infant. My great-grandfather came over to Canada. He was 34 years old at the time. And then my grandmother, Dorothy Wright, she was born into a family that had been many generations in Canada. Their background, I believe, is also Scottish.
My mother came to Toronto, Canada, just after the war. We stayed with my aunt and my grandfather for a short period. Beverly and Queen, next to right around Grange Park. That's where my aunt's house was. She was from Jamaica, St. Anne's, Jamaica.
In the early 19th century, the first Irish immigrants to Upper Canada were working on farms and as artisans. In modest numbers, they grew in order to plan land settlements and primarily to work on canals, timber, and railways.
One of the opportunities they have in North America is actually have their own land. When you think that the Canada Company, which owned 1 million acres, which they absconded from the Ojibwe people in a somewhat shady deal, when 1 million acres are available, and initially you can have 100 acres that you can pay off over 10 years and it'll be yours. Imagine an Irish farmer who has had only about 3 to 6 acres paying rent for that, and yet coming here and having the opportunity to own his or her own land.
To colonize most of the province, the Canada Company was founded. About 2.5 million acres of land were acquired to sell to buyers across Europe. It also helped new settlers immigrate by carrying them on its steamboats and giving them inexpensive land. While colonists established a permanent foothold on the continent, Indigenous peoples were uprooted from their ancestral homes.
There's never a deal that can take away our relationship with the land all across Canada. The mural behind me is titled Interconnection. Interconnection implies that we are connected to the land, no matter where we are or who we are. We are very vulnerable to the destiny of how we treat the land.
It would take some 6 to 8 weeks to cross the Atlantic, oftentimes in ships that were not intended for passengers. During the famine, some ships lost, up to 20% or 25% of people who died of illnesses that spread quite quickly when you're below decks. A treacherous journey that's probably made even less palatable by the fact that every port of entry in Canada all become quarantine stations.
My grandmother would have been, I guess she would have been maybe early 30s, like 31, and bringing 2 small children, including an infant, over on a boat like that. The journey would have been long, and they came to Montreal. I guess the spouse would come over first, find work, find somewhere to live, and then send for them. And that's, for the women, I think that was particularly hard. You're on your own back home, and then you've got to make the journey over to the country by yourself, but you've got the kids. So it means that he was able to get enough money together to bring them over fairly quickly.
That they had an incredible degree of agency because they knew many family and friends who were already there. They had received letters from them. They had received money from them. And families were essentially, in many cases, being reunited.
So my great-great-grandfather, a stonemason, he worked on next door at Casa Loma. You know, my grandfather wouldn't have come from much. I've seen the street he was born on over in Scotland, and you know, it's not a wealthy area.
With the strong push to populate and build the cities, about 3 million immigrants arrived between 1900 and 1914. Countless small red brick houses were constructed close to the city center. On the outskirts of cities, large and opulent homes started to sprout. Due to the building boom, immigrant workers from a diverse array of cultures, including Chinese, Black, Doukhobor, and Mormon workers, were drawn to Canada.
My grandfather, he was recruited to work on the Canadian Pacific Railroad. So he joined about 17,000 other Chinese workers, stringing telephone wire. So he was here for 4 years. Somehow he managed to survive the brutal conditions of working on the western portion of the CPR, because that was the toughest part. It's the western portion where you had to blow through rock, and you had to go through canyons along the Fraser River. And then 10 years later, in 1891, he opened up a dry goods store, and he learned how to become a tailor. So then he sent for my grandmother, who arrived in 1891, and I just can't imagine. She came on a boat with Mrs. Chow, and took them 3 months to sail there, paid for her head tax, and brought her to Cumberland.
A lengthy trip of up to 12 weeks could be caused by poor ocean weather. In such situations, some captains would overcharge immigrants for meals or even harass female passengers. On the other hand, most Chinese women were effectively forbidden because of the increasing head tax. Similar discrimination was faced by Punjabi workers who arrived on the Komagata Maru in 1914 and were denied entry and returned to India despite being subjects of the British Raj.
The area in which my aunt lived was referred to as the ward. The ward was where New City Hall is today. And it was referred to as Shanty Town. It was poor, but very rich in culture.
The ward was bounded by College, Queen, and Yonge Streets, as well as University Avenue. Refugees from the Irish potato famine, Jews from Russia and Eastern Europe, emancipated African Americans, African Canadians, Chinese and Italian immigrants, and many others lived here in poor housing. The ward was eventually demolished to make room for Nathan Phillips Square, the Eaton Center, New City Hall, and government buildings. Businesses, theaters, and shops were permanently shut down as residents were forced out.
Where we used to live in Lansdowne House is a small little island with a peninsula. The Anglicans lived in the peninsula and the Catholic lived in the island. So there was a religious division. So when I graduated, I was facing the world with a diploma in my hand saying that I completed a 4-year program at the Ontario College of Art. My life changed when I designed the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples logo.
On my mother's side, my great-grandfather arrived in about 1890. He came up to Vancouver from San Francisco. And in Vancouver at that time, many of the Chinese farmers came from a certain area. It's called Zhongshan. And my great-grandfather figured out that he could do very well helping them sell the vegetables. So he got a horse and a cart, and then the cooks would come out and buy vegetables.
The entry of new immigrants to Canada was for factory employment, building work, or cheap labor. The ideal immigrants at the time were named by the Canadian government in order of preference. Farmers from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, Switzerland, Finland, Russia, Germany, Ukraine, and Poland came after British and American farmers. The least attractive groups in the eyes of both the general public and the government included Italians, South Slavs, Greeks, and Syrians. Jewish, Asian, Roma, and black workers ranked at the very bottom of the list. These newcomers encountered biases that had hitherto mostly been directed at Irish Catholics.
If you were to take a look at the photographs of that generation, they were dressed so well. Really sharp-looking young people. And the only opportunities that they had at that time was work in a restaurant or to open a restaurant or a grocery store. So you see that contrast.
She was a stalwart nanny for the Eaton family, actually. A lot of the nannies in the city at that time, they never had really too much to choose from. Being the underclass, they would have menial type jobs, labor jobs, I guess. Jobs as domestics, cooks, taxi drivers, construction workers. And then there's a lot of nannies from the UK, from Wales, England, Ireland. A lot of women would seek opportunity here in Canada, and they'd work as domestics or nannies. And that in the textile industry, working, sewing, that kind of thing. It was kind of an immigrant's job, you might say. Or an immigrant opportunity. Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong, I did know one or two black lawyers, doctors, but they were people I could count on my hand.
I would say that the majority of people working for this family are white. If you were different, if you went against the norm, even if you were white or white presenting, you probably had a difficult time still. If you were Irish Catholic, if you were Italian, if you were Jewish, you weren't seen as an equal.
Families from privileged backgrounds settled in some of the richest areas of the nation. To make way for the spectacular gardens, stone mansions, and red brick villas, the trees at Forest Hill, Summerhill, and Rosedale were cleared.
It wasn't exactly the easiest thing in the world to be an immigrant at any time in history. Of course, they had certain privileges that they could get away with. They were Protestant and they came from British parts of the world.
When an Irish migrant arrives here, let's say in the 1880s or the 1890s, and they come from rural Ireland, the best that they can expect is to meet a fellow Irish person who will take them in either as an apprentice to a business, or really start at the bottom of the pecking order, so to speak. So for women, one of the best ways of earning is to serve as a domestic servant. But I mean, many of the wealthier Irish Catholics and their descendants took pride in the fact that they hired, their kinsmen and their co-religionists to jobs in the breweries and in the furniture factories and the like.
My grandmother, when she would retell stories of her childhood, she made it sound like everything was an adventure. And even my grandfather, they would tell you stories about taking the streetcar across the city when it was a big deal back then, and going to dances and going to Sunnyside Pavilion and the amusement parks and all of that stuff. They made it sound like it was almost magical. And when they talk about the stuff they did and the freedom they had as children to get on the transit, and my grandmother talking about her and her dog Laddie jumping on the streetcar, and sometimes the dog would come home by itself and all the drivers would know where to let it off. It was a different time, right? Like, it's not like now, but, I used to think, she's a bit of a badass, right? Like, my grandmother did stuff that maybe other people didn't do when they were younger. Every time I drive by Knox Presbyterian Church with my kids, every time we're going by there or we're walking by on Spadina, my older son says, do you know anybody that went there? Mom, would you like to tell us another story? I said, you know what, you can shut up now.
I guess the brothers of the Secret Sacrament from Ottawa used to come and visit. And there used to be the nuns that used to come and visit. So we used to enjoy their company and the entertainment and sports activities. You know, I was maybe 10, 11 years old at the time. Every day we went swimming. Every day we were kicked out of our homes to go hang out with our peers and be creative. My friends and my cousins. We played in the beach all day long, and, you know, we would go swimming pretty much every hour. I'd like to call it my childhood wonderment, or childhood wonder. It was a welcoming sight for me to engage with people that were from other cultures. Non-native people. They were mostly white people. And as a matter of fact, I remember this one time a teacher, and we didn't think he was any different than us, but we were just so impressed with his skin color. And I thought that was kind of like a celebratory and very fond kinship.
Well, as a child, it was great. As I remember, my aunt, in their big old house, had a banister I used to slide down all the time. Well, she was a very tall, kind of almost overbearing woman, and she used to quite frighten me. And I saw her as a giant. That's what I referred to her as a giant. And that remark should say, "I'll bite your head off." She looked after Timothy Eaton's daughter's children. The Eatons would come to her home. I do recall my mother answering the door when these two blonde fellas came out of a limousine and asked to speak to their mother. And my mother had said, "Your mother?" And then my aunt came running from the kitchen and said, "My babies."
She would also tell me stories about, obviously, the Eaton family, who I believe had a home next to Spadina House. They offered things in their stores like kind of etiquette lessons and stuff. They got my grandmother referred to it as charm school, and she made her own children attend. She grew up knowing that how one conducts oneself in society and how you carry yourself and having learning social skills was really going to get you somewhere. Even poor people dressed properly.
My father had the Embassy Cafe in Prince George. So I grew up in the cafe. Smorgasbord. Uncle Alec and Uncle Victor introduced that to Vancouver. So they brought in some very famous people. The Embassy Cafe was called the Chinese Canadian Cafe. The food that they served was Chinese Canadian food. So it would be stylized for the Western taste. Now, what was really interesting about the little places, the little cafes throughout Canada that were run by Chinese families was their pastry shelf. They learned these recipes when they worked in the big houses in Victoria, Vancouver, here in Toronto. And they made, obviously the meals and baked for these upper class families. Spices and condiments we would use, say black bean, for example, would be foreign to Western taste.
She had a big home that she turned into a diner. So all I recall really is the guests that would come through the house, the smell of food, typical Caribbean food, rice and peas, curry chicken, saltfish and ackee, ham hocks, chicken feet, bit of adventure to sit down to a plate of souse or pig's feet is what they called it. I know that's something that a lot of people have to kind of get their mind around in order to eat.
And most of the people who came to the Embassy Cafe at that time were working men. So they would be working in pulp and paper or in the lumbering industry. The food that the cooks would eat would be different from the food that was prepared for. Now, if you were to go back in time, there are foods that Chinese people would eat that Westerners would be like appalled at. But you have to remember that the reason why Chinese and many other cultures will eat every part of an animal is because they were poor.
In terms of what they were eating, so if they were going to be eating any sort of exotic food, we'll call it. It really is kind of like a once in a while thing, even though, interestingly enough, in one of the grocery receipts that we have, they're actually on like spices listed as one of the items purchased, a variety of spices. But in the 50s, there were 2 Chinese cooks that were here, and I do believe they were making Chinese dishes for Anna Kathleen. I also think that whoever she was entertaining.
I think my grandmother's family maybe had a better life than my grandfather's family. When I would hear my grandfather talking about his life, it sounded a lot rougher, because she wasn't a recent immigrant. You know, they'd been generations here. You get settled, you're more prosperous. Whereas that first generation that comes over, it's tough. You know, and it takes that one generation before you can kind of be more successful. Not always, or certainly back then, right? Because now people come over and they're educated when they come into the country and things like that, but they weren't back then. They were just laborers. They just needed laborers.
Spadina and the Spadina Museum is just a small view of a history that's so broad.
Our house is called Spadina. The Baldwins, who were here before the Austins, they built a house here. When people come here for the first time, in general, they're always wowed by just the sheer size of this house.
Her father and her uncles and everybody were going into these houses that were owned by wealthy people, and they saw how those people carried themselves and how they dressed and you know what kind of etiquette they used. So when I toured this Spadina house, it was interesting seeing all of this, right? You know, because you're saying that's the kind of thing she probably saw.
Servants didn't eat with the family. They ate alone. You don't speak unless you're spoken to. You don't intrude into family business. You wouldn't fraternize with, the elder, males of the house. You would discipline the children, but not too severely. There are all kinds, and it would vary from house to house as to what rules were set down.
I would imagine the servants were eating similar food to what the family is eating, if it's not the exact same food. The servants were eating in this room, actually, they were eating in the kitchen, while the family was eating just on the other side of the wall in the dining room.
Spitna is the Anishinaabe word, meaning that it's of a high place. Today, when you look at it, and what's up there, the Casa Loma, you look at an architectural wonder, let's say, or design, that reflects colonialism, that reflects this great wall.
When this area was essentially taken, bought from the indigenous people, it was then kind of segmented, and it was given out to various members of the executive committee. I do know that Peter Russell had slaves that were brought here when he moved here from England. So Peter Russell, who's on this committee, he takes this land, he's given this land, and he gives it to his, I believe his friend or his family member, William Wilcox.
At one time, I think the Anishinaabe people lived there. And if you even turn back the clock 15,000 years ago, the water ran right up to Davenport. So that would have been a shore. And that's where the First Nations people lived. And that would have been kind of like a migratory route to get to the Humber River all the way up to Sault Ste. Marie, even up to my reserve in Muscandaga. That was the connection to the Ottawa-Vasquez River that connects all the way like an artery that runs 750 kilometers or so all the way to Hudson's Bay.
So there are some art pieces in the house that do not depict indigenous people well. So there's a few art pieces that are stereotypical, they're prejudiced, they are showing a very specific angle of indigenous people. So the indigenous communities and cultures are considered exotic to the wealthy of Canada, especially in Toronto. Which is so ironic because you have people who have been living here for thousands and thousands of years, There's elements of Greek culture, different Asian cultures, Egyptian culture, but they're not really being showcased to celebrate these cultures. More or so, it's more appropriation.
You know, it's a difference between being born with money and making your own money. There's always going to be that difference, and depending on if you make your money in a trade, that's very different than making your money in other ways. And people back then used to work longer, like they did. There was no retirement and stuff. So that my grandfather that was a stonemason, obviously he wasn't making ends meet, so they would have boarders in the home and rent out rooms. There could be 15 people or something living at an address. He eventually got glaucoma, which affects your vision. So obviously times were tough.
Albert Austin, who owned this house, had 7 servants. One of those servants was a chauffeur, one was a cook, one was a gardener, one was in the nursery. Then there were the spouses of them. So, it was quite an entourage. But the servants were usually better fed than many of their colleagues who lived, in places off Queen Street or definitely in the ward.
I feel like the servants of this house are always seen as that. They're seen as servants, especially by Albert and Mary. They are here to work. They're not really here to socialize, not here to even be seen unless requested. There are sets of stairs through the house that are just for the servants to use. The cook and potentially nannies were living on the second floor, but they were really close to the family. There's actually letters that Mary wrote that says that she's excited for the third floor to be built so that the servants can finally be away from the family quarter. And at that time, they built the third floor. So think of that. You're in your room and, your day is done, but you hear this bell. No matter what, you have to go.
Domestic work, particularly for women, became the most popular type of job in the late 19th century as a means of immigrating to Canada. Nearly 80,000 women were employed as domestic workers in 1891. Low social status, irregular hours, loneliness, and a lack of independence persisted over time. As a result, Canada experienced a domestic worker shortage after the Second World War.
In the Toronto back then, there was no such thing as a 5-day work week. You worked on Saturdays. My grandfather would do clerical work. You'd go to work Monday to Friday, and then Saturday you'd go into it again, and you'd get out at maybe 1 o'clock or 2 in the afternoon.
So, onerous, long days, 24/7, and particularly if you're doing childcare, you're on call, because if a baby cries in the middle of the night, you're responsible for getting up and tending to that child. If you're in a house much like the Austins, where you have 7 servants doing a variety of things, and a much larger house, that affords you a better quality of life.
But I do believe that the children of Albert and Mary had more respect for them as human beings than Albert and Mary. Especially Percy Austin, he's the oldest son. There is a lot of stories of him being very friendly with the servants. Actually, when he died, a lot of them were quite sad because he was a really lovely person. So it's interesting to see how different generations are treating servants and expecting them to help as well. So the main half of that floor is for him, but the other half of the floor is for the female servants. So they get their own rooms. It's a pretty decent size. While the male servants, the chauffeur and the gardener and the gardener's assistant, they are working very hard, but they get their own spaces. They get their own places to live in. They get to have families here to live with them, and they get paid more overall. So there was a really interesting period of time where the daughters of the family, specifically Constance Margaret, maybe Anna Kathleen, also probably Adele, but just depending on where they are in their life, and Mary Austin, they had to be the ones taking care of the house. But there was a letter sent by Albert that talks about how hard that was, how difficult life was for them at that time, because they had to cook and clean for themselves.
And I know my grandmother, she was an only child, and her own father, she was expected to, more the women had to do this, right? Her grandmother She was a woman before her time running a plumbing business, the Wright Brothers Plumbing. And she got, all of her, to convince all of your kids to go into the trade when your husband's passed away and have all these businesses be a going concern, that she had to have been pretty smart.
A woman could either stay a spinster, get married, but you couldn't work for the most part, professionally or be employed generally outside of blue collar or pink collar trades if you were married. So staying in the home. What would be two ways that she could support the family? One, opening up the front of the house, or as a tavern. The other was the grocery business, making sure that she turned the front room of a very small house into a place where neighbors could come, or she could take in work as a seamstress to repair clothing, to make clothing. So these would all keep her within the house, managing children.
So my great-grandfather's plumbing shop is now what is at Church and Wood. There's a building there called the Hair of the Dog Pub. They installed in a lot of the old Toronto homes the original plumbing and heating. So the stonemason work was probably maybe worse because you're building houses where a lot of the plumbing, they were going into existing houses to do it. So you might not have had as long hours.
They lived in several places in Chinatown. In the family business, the aunts would take in clothing to repair, and they helped make the garments as well. There was an opera house in Victoria, so they used to do the beading for the dresses and do repairs. And then the boys would pack everything up in a little wagon, and then they would deliver them.
Chinatowns were important locations for companies and families that formed the heart and soul of Chinese Canada. In contrast to stereotypes of them as overcrowded ghettos, they were a safe haven from the hostile environment that surrounded. Chinese immigrants were frequently stigmatized as sojourners, and discriminatory policies hindered them from settling permanently in Canada. Numerous xenophobic beliefs further ostracized Chinese Canadians. Due to the high head tax, just 7% of Chinese people in Canada were women in 1931.
My grandmother had told my aunt it was a very lonely existence because women were not allowed out onto the street. Right? So all the women were kept inside. And back then, if you had a wife, you were considered very fortunate because number one, who would bring a wife and try to raise a family in an environment that was so hostile? Number two, the cost of her passage and then to pay her head tax and then the difficult journey that she would have to make. My grandmother, the only place that she would go in Victoria was to Beacon Hill Park. She said to my aunt, if there was a bridge to China, she would walk home. That's how lonely she was. For the Chinese, as well as many other ethno-racial communities, there was just a whole slew of federal, provincial, and municipal racist legislation. It's called the Royal Group 76, and those are all the head taxes. And on those head taxes, you'll get a lot of information. How old the person was, a photograph of the person, where they came from, and they used to have to carry those head tax certificates around because if you didn't have a head tax certificate, they could just scoop you up. So the head tax was imposed not once, but like 3 times, and then there was total exclusion.
When she was supposed to have a younger sibling, I believe it was a younger brother, and my great-grandmother was in labor, as was another wealthy woman the same day. So the doctor, kind of checked on her and then went over to the wealthy families, delivered their baby, and then they were all out, carousing and drinking, the man afterwards, and he just went along with them and didn't go back to check on my great-grandmother until it was too late, and the baby had passed away. So clearly, even if they were kind of elevated in society, they still weren't the priority. There was that bit of edge to it, right?
It wasn't a time, the city back in those days, wasn't too diverse. Paul Robeson was a huge American black icon. When he came to town, I guess he stayed with my aunt because at the time, being the 30s and the time of racism, he couldn't get a hotel room.
In the majority of British colonies, chattel slavery was outlawed in 1834. However, notions about racial inferiority persisted, and for many years following were used to justify the segregation of black workers in Canada in a variety of employment settings. There are several instances of land titles with restrictions that forbid renting or selling to colored people. It is hardly surprising that people in Canada were frequently denied services because of their race.
I don't think I learned anything about racism until I left the reserve when I was 20 years old, when I moved to Thunder Bay. I learned about segregation. I learned about colonialism. I learned about systemic racism and how I was treated in the justice system. There's a book called When Freedom is Lost. And what these two students wrote was their experience as they landed in a place called Lansdowne House where I grew up. When those two writers, they were speaking of what contrast it was from their way of life to our way of life. It was kind of like a black and white scenario.
Whites Only was a real place in Vancouver. And it simply said, whites only. And it was a big neon sign for a restaurant. And the Whites Only restaurant advertised exactly who it was for. So if you're not white, don't go there to eat.
Toronto, about 125 years ago, was a Protestant Irish Belfast. Okay? If you were Irish Catholic, you were marginalized. You could not work for the city. So, I mean, it wasn't always about color, right? It was about power and religion. And the Irish Catholic was referred to as the underdog. Okay?
The majority of early Irish immigrants were Protestant. The land was more readily available, and they often found it easier to re-establish themselves as farmers. They tended to proclaim their patriotism to the monarchy, Protestantism, and ties to Britain. In contrast, Catholics were perceived as culturally less sophisticated and became underprivileged and a source of cheap labor.
I think there are probably three major challenges. The first is that he speaks the English language. So many from the west of Ireland, even in the post-famine period, may have spoken Irish, Gaelic, as their first language. They couldn't get a job, for example, in Eaton's on the floor because they didn't speak, the Queen's English. Okay. Another impediment might be education. I'd say the biggest barrier, though, was religion. You would have a built-in bias by many Protestants that somehow Catholics were lesser because they were controlled by priests and the Pope. My grandmother was born of Scottish and Irish parents in Glasgow in actually 1902 and came to this city in 1919 as a teenager. She spoke, as she always did, a heavily brogued English because she had a very distinctive Scottish accent. Now, she was lucky because at that point, Scots and English unmarried women were favored in the domestic service that many Canadians and many Canadians of Irish descent who were women wouldn't take at that point because, in a sense, they had moved on and became less and less a factor in domestic service. Among the most popular for domestic servants, at least in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, were Irish. These would be single women, sometimes with a family, sometimes coming on their own, who would live in, spoke English for the most part, even though it might be heavily accented, and were considered quite reliable. And you have the prototype of the Biddy or Bridget, who is the Irish house girl.
Jane Grey was a long-serving member of the Austins. But even she only got paid well, so to speak, because she did a lot of things. So she was a maid, but she also took in laundry. She also probably helped with cooking. The Austins were spending over $100 a month in groceries. But it's weird for me to think that a person is getting paid less than what their manager, supervisor's grocery bill would be. It's interesting to compare the two. And if you look most of the time in these ones, at the bottom, you have the servants and the maids and whatnot who are hired for these events, and they're getting paid less than items cost to rent, which is interesting. To have to come here and work however many hours they're going to work, paid, or is valued less than the item that they're serving.
The average yearly salary for female domestic helpers was $284 for both live-in and non-resident domestics in the 1930s. The minority of male live-in domestic service workers typically earned 2 to 5 times what women did.
What you take into account are several factors. First, the actual hourly wage that's earned. Secondly, the number of weeks in a year that you can actually work. And then cost of living. So that means that wage that's being brought in, even a unionized wage, has to stretch 52 weeks a year because the year doesn't change. And that means sometimes, and oftentimes, the mother, the matriarch of the family, goes out to work. Her wage level might be only half of what the wages of her husband are, but nonetheless, when you add that to the pot, it helps bring up the real wage a little bit.
Both Canadian orphanages and British child emigration groups employed children. The House of Industry was founded in times of economic crisis to assist the many unemployed individuals, particularly recent immigrants. It offered food and lodging to the poor, who often had to perform duties in exchange for assistance. Additionally, it provided housing for abandoned or orphaned children, frequently employing them as indentured servants in residences and farms in and around Toronto.
There was a place in Toronto called the House of Industry. So I don't know exactly when in history this was, but in this family there were two girls who were hired by the Austins to work as servants. And because these girls are of Irish descent, a part of me feels like they're probably tapping into their own culture a bit, because James Austin, as I mentioned, was from Ireland, so they have Irish roots.
And I come from a background of residential school also. I went to residential school for 3 years in McIntosh, near Kenora, and one in Fort Francis for a year. And I remember in McIntosh, the residential school burnt down. And I remember standing in front of it at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, apparently with my cousins. And I was so happy. It is quite a contrast to the way I grew up and interfered with in the way I was brought up with my mom and my dad. I mean, we lived a life in a traditional way, and we had an abundance and access to the lands and its resources. And to take that away and put in place the colonial way of thinking is quite a foreign concept of that age.
There is the story of Margaret Wallace. Margaret Wallace is the cook in the 20s and 30s. So when she was sick, they liked her enough to keep her, and she got better in the room, most likely in the house. And they hired on a gentleman named Jesse Cookson. And as soon as she gets better, they just basically, without notice, fire him and just kick him out of the door. Sort of related, but unrelated, there's a case of Mildred Snell, who is the live-in nurse for Mary Austin. She is traveling with Mary. She is eating probably in the dining room. When Mary dies, Mildred has to go to court to try to get money. And in Vera's case, she breaks her arm, and when she gets back to the house, the family basically says, well, you didn't tell us you were leaving, and you broke your arm, like, just gallivanting, so you're fine. So she ends up going to some lawyers, and what happens out of that is she gets 2 weeks worth of pay, but how they are being respected and treated, it varies quite a lot.
If servants got sick, it depended again on the families as to whether they were retained or whether they were sent back if they had a family in the city to recuperate there, or whether they were dismissed. Or even resisting the advances of an eldest son or the master of the house could lead to termination. There's very little recourse that a female domestic servant has other than to leave. And so they're basically at the mercy of the master of the house.
In addition, the Canadian government supported a significant influx of immigrants and colonists from Europe. There were, however, a number of restrictive immigration laws in effect, such as the Continuous Journey Rule, which limited workers immigrating from India, the head tax, and the restriction of Japanese and black immigration, all of which were imposed in response to misinformed public sentiment.
So during the Depression in the 1930s, there was massive unemployment all across Canada, and there was some money in the form of stamps given to families, so that the loss of the man's wage wasn't as devastating as what it could be. It still was devastating, but it did force women to go out and work. Of course, there are wages from soldiers coming back home, but at the same time, there are wages now being produced by women in munitions factories, in armaments factories, and in various other war industries. One of the barriers has been broken.
During the Depression, for the Chinese community, they did not have any access to whatever social assistance was made available. One of the ways of the thinking at that time was that if you were involved in a grocery store or food production, or had a small cafe or a restaurant, at least you'd always be able to put food on the table. But for ethno-racial communities, there were additional barriers and hurdles. If I was born and grew up during that time, I don't think I could have handled what they went through.
As time went on and as Irish integrated into society, Irish Catholics particularly, they became part of the power structure and can be equally as discriminatory, which meant that they were now part of the host society in greeting other immigrants, which proved to be difficult for them when even fellow Catholics came to the city that in some ways paralleled the Irish experience. They didn't speak the language, they ate different foods, like they celebrated different ways, and so the Irish now are creating their own tier system.
So if you were a racialized family, they didn't want you really living there. We moved out to Scarborough, and there was a petition that was circulating the neighborhood because they saw us looking for a house in the neighborhood, and it was stopped by a French-Canadian family.
The stories like my father would tell me that my father, as I found out much later on in life, was a boxer when he was young. And the reason why he took up boxing was that whenever the Chinese kids got beat up, my dad would try to step in. But he said, we didn't go out of our way to create trouble, but if trouble came to us, we'd be ready for it. The Chinese workers were the first people in Canada to go on strike. I think that was during the time when they were working in the Dunsmuir mines, coal mines. Very, very bad conditions. And he said, you know what? We can't have people dying all the time. We need better working conditions. So they go on strike. So during that part, there were about 17,000 Chinese who came, and they say that one Chinese died for every mile of track that was laid. So the CPR, that portion of the CPR, is being held together by the blood and bones of the Chinese who died along.
My grandfather went to France during the First World War, and he went with an all-black battalion called the No. 2 Construction Battalion. They didn't allow them to serve. They had to fight very hard. They built bridges. They chopped wood. They provided lumber. But they did suffer mustard gas and things like that. And there's so many levels of bias or marginalization. And they were the subject of racism and abuse. But they soldiered on, you know.
So there is a black chapter in my life, which I am not ashamed to talk of these days, because that is what gives me strength and what gives me hope today. Those two writers saw Lansdowne House as a pleasant looking place. But once they got off the plane, the story changed, because what they saw was people drinking, people fighting, and people doing damage. And the teenagers apparently were running rampant. In my own personal experience with my alcoholism took me to the depths of it, where, you know, I ended up in court on very many occasions because of the challenges, because I was involved in gangs. And that's what I refer to as my black chapter, which I learned from and continue to make amends for.
So as soon as the CPR was completed, the first head tax was imposed, $50. That was in 1885. Then it went up to $100 in 1900, and then in 1905, it went up to $500. Now $500 per person at that time could buy a whole house. So you see that barriers, you know, that were placed on them. Then in 1923, they said head taxes are not fair to the Chinese community, so we're going to stop head tax. And guess what? What we're going to do? We're going to stop Chinese immigration altogether. So from 1923 to 1947, there was no Chinese immigration to Canada. And it created huge hardships for families that were separated. You could not bring your wife or your children here.
When I was in the depths of my alcoholism, I was contemplating whether I should continue to live or not. So I proceeded to walk across the kitchen table with a golden knife. And it was at that moment I heard this knock on the door. First Nations constable. And he says, "Oh, the judge wants to see you at the airport." And I got on the back of the seat of the skidoo, took me to the airport. I go inside the plane, and the judge said, "Oh, Judge Mitchell sent me to deal with you." So he read the charges, and then he sentenced me to 30 days. And that's how I got out of that situation, because of the judge's, I guess, orchestrating to get me out of that reserve. And I remember looking out that window, my reserve got smaller and smaller, and I felt better and better the more distance there was. I ended up in Thunder Bay District Jail, which was a haven for me. 3 square meals, a bed, and some clothing under the auspices of the government of Ontario.
While there was, yes, all kinds of systemic barriers, all kinds of anti-Chinese legislation, there were also some very decent people as well. So, for example, in 1921-22, the Victoria Board of Education segregated Chinese students. And what happened there was that, I think it was Mr. Hamilton, who's a prominent lawyer in Victoria. He took on that case. Chinese community raised $6,000 to pay for his legal fees, and he charged them $1. That was his retainer, $1.
And I got to thank that judge later on, years later, because I went to treatment. I joined AA, I got sober, graduated, and then I called him. I said, "Thank you." He says, I never get a call from anybody to thank me for sentencing them to jail. Judge Roy Mitchell was very instrumental in saving my life. It was divine intervention for sure.
And then when Charles H. Tupper's grandson, he was largely raised by at least fed by my cousin's father, because he was a cook in that house. So Lieutenant Colonel Merrick received the Victoria Cross. They had a big parade for him in Vancouver. My cousin's father went out to see the parade, and he was wearing his cook's clothing. And Lieutenant Colonel Merrick, he stopped the parade, and he ran up and he hugged my cousin's father.
One day I was buying like a pile of books, and this kind lady was behind the counter, and I walked up with a pile of books, like I don't know how many books I had, and she's looking at me and looking at the books again, and she said, "What are you doing buying all these books of dead white people?" Well, these books were very instrumental in the way I researched and conducted my projects. I had to work with Haudenosaunee people in order to do this mural. Dr. O, Oriniateka, means burning cloud. And he's Mohawk from Six Nations. Peter Martin, as his baptismal name was, when he was 19 years old, I would assume maybe the grandmothers from Six Nations asked him to do a welcoming speech to royalty. And he was only given 2 minutes. But in that 2 minutes, he must have said something that really impressed the Prince of Wales and his entourage, that he was invited to follow up his education in London, England, where he graduated to become one of the first or second doctors in Canada. The purple shirt that he was addressing was only meant for royalty at the time. And he's got his arms all stretched out addressing the royalty, Prince of Wales and his entourage. Dr. Peter Martin was instrumental in dealing with First Nations rights and influential in women's rights and children's rights. When he died, 10,000 people lined up around the Massey Hall to pay respects to him. Can you imagine that?
So when I moved to Toronto, I was essentially adopted by Valerie Ma and her husband Daniel Ma. Valerie Ma was became the first Chinese principal in Toronto. She was just an amazing person who influenced generations of students. She started out as an elementary school teacher, and she was in the education system for 40 years. Yeah.
So Mrs. Pitkin was a laundress for this family. Her name is Mrs. Louisa Pitkin. She is an escaped slave. She escapes the Maryland area in the 1850s, and she comes up to Toronto with her husband Jefferson in I think 1871 for sure. There's a lot of sad truths to her. So her children, as far as we know, never make it to Canada. They're kind of disbanded and they're sold and brought to other houses. But if you look at portraits of other people at that time, very rarely are they of color. I believe it was Anne Arthur's who actually painted Mrs. Pitkin's portrait.
The Chinese were denied the right to vote. So when the Second World War happened, about 500 young Chinese Canadian men and women enlisted, even though they were not considered Canadians. But they wanted to enlist because they said, we are Canadian, we're born here, we are Canadian, and we're going to show you that we are just as Canadian as anyone else. So they went to India. So after the war, Chinese still didn't have the right to vote. Uncle Alec and his buddies put on their uniform and put on all their medals. And they marched from Chinatown to the whites-only restaurant. They opened the door and they sat on the counter because the owner could not serve a man in uniform. So that's how they broke the color barrier.
And it was just recently, 2 weeks ago, that the Canadian government offered an apology to them for their recognition of service.
I don't care what it says on paper. If it's a settlers or colonial-minded paper, then so be it. That's your paper. We haven't given up that right. Toronto is still our home. Tacarano is still our home.
A huge turning point for ethno-racial communities was the Second World War. Got the right to vote. You were able to move outside of Chinatown. Otherwise, you have to live, in Chinatown. Immigration eased up so that fathers who were here, who used to go back to China every 2 or 3 years to see their family in China, are now able to sponsor their family. So there was family reunification.
So there was that, So we had a lot of barriers, I would say, to move through at that time. But then, we immersed ourselves in the neighborhood, and we were loved by people, and we loved back, and it was all okay.
Right? I think my mother was very careful. Keep your head low and down. Nobody would try to chop it off. But I'm not from that school.
I was extremely close to my grandparents, but my grandfather was very strong on morals and religion and that sort of thing. And I think that comes from that childhood where you don't have a lot of money, your social life revolves around the church.
A working class person wears a number of hats. They can wear their religious hat and their cultural hat, but they also wear their class hat. But at the same time, they share a common cause in the issues that arise from, a late 19th, early 20th century industrial society, from not being able to make ends meet, from poor wages to the rise of cost of living, to rent and housing.
I have relatives who are Ukrainian, indigenous, black, Finnish, Hungarian, German, Japanese. As I say, you're not taught that there are these differences. And then when you become much older, you're given the language of difference.
The mural behind me speaks of that relationship and that interconnection for you and I. We are connected and we are the same in many ways. And that's the similarities that we should focus on and bring in the light to the world and to the future. Mind you, we also have truckloads of stories that were written by the hand of the colonial settlers. And that's not our stories. We can tell our stories about the Spadina Museum. All we have to do is talk to a First Nations person. I'm not saying it's a better story, but we have our story.
I had no idea how difficult it was for them. I also had no idea how integrated the community was with the larger community. So it's just amazing. You look at the elders in the community, you ask if you can have a bit of their time, and what they tell you is just it's fascinating. And you're not going to find it written anywhere.
Like I said, when you're a kid, you're not paying attention in the same way you would have as you're an adult. I wish I had listened more to some of the stories. And I always remember my grandmother mentioning Spadina House, and I used to think, I think she means Spadina, but no, she's correct. It's Spadina House. Well, I just remember her telling us that no, it's called Spadina House. I'm like, okay. And we used to think, oh, she just doesn't know what she's talking about. No, like, now, in hindsight, I apologize, Grandma. I'm wrong.
When visible minorities begin to fill the ranks of new Canadians, so Canadians from India, China, the Caribbean, Africa, even Latin America, I mean, the Irish are now in a position of being part of that charter Anglo group that sees a superiority over new group, and particularly a superiority in whiteness over those who aren't white.
Racism was commonplace in society. And that really eroded all our standings and challenges to the way we live as First Nations people, whether it be Haudenosaunee or Anishinaabe or Cherokee or Sioux or other nations.
Fortunately, we have people who are willing to challenge those in the same way that the earlier generations did. But we enjoy so much more now. Now, having said that, does that mean that there's no discrimination? It's still there.
We're still talking about being underrepresented. Okay. So that will tell you that, there's still a lot of work to be done, I think.
Dr. O, we don't hear about him. There's a lane named after him. Why don't we name streets like Jarvis or all these people, the embezzlers and all these criminals that are, named after these streets? We have statues. I think we should change some of the names on the streets and maybe call it Dr. O Street or Avenue or Dr. O whatever, right? Moriateka. Look today. We've got women that are First Nations, Assembly of First Nations chiefs. We've got the Governor General, that's a First Nations woman. And the Supreme Court has just appointed a woman, that's First Nations. I think these are changes that are continuing.
One of the things I find really interesting is when we have school groups or even our volunteers learn about history, because oftentimes they won't know how hard it was for groups of people in this city to survive, let alone thrive.
So many ethno-racial groups came, and so many of those groups each contributed to dismantling. And for me, it was the same thing. I wanted my nieces and nephews not to experience anything. I want them to walk down the street and to be treated and recognized.
It's something that we can demonstrate to future generations. And wouldn't it be nice to leave and package and put a bow on that message for them to see? And I think we are doing that. Some of us are.
It's an evolution, social evolution.
And amends is, I think, is the key word in reconciliation process. Because in Canadian chapter of the Truth is very ugly in how they conducted business in acquiring and raping the land that continues today. When I first looked at this great wall of a colonial setting that at the time I thought had no holes to bring the light in. But what is coming more into view are people that are more open-minded, that are more helpful. And that, I think, is the light that brings in and tears down this great wall that creates a division between us. Our barriers are taken down. The great wall is being taken down.